Hi, girls. Welcome to our first flip lecture on Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is going to be focusing on the death of Jesus. As you can see here from these vocabulary words, the essential theology is going to be a review from Chapters 2 and 3. But it is important that we review it because it's central to our faith, and this is also going to give me the ability to correct a few misunderstandings that I saw on your Chapters 2 and 3 test, because the basis of this theology is in Chapters 2 and 3. But we're going to be looking at Jesus' death, and to begin with, the chapter looks at the idea of suffering and what is the meaning of suffering. And today in class, or next class after you watch this, we are going to be doing an activity reflecting on the suffering in the world. But the chapter opens with a very tender reflection on the meaning of suffering. And this is, generally pages 130 through 133. And this is sort of a review for us because we covered these ideas in Chapter 2, but what is the meaning of suffering? And as we know, God is not the cause of suffering because he's not the cause of physical or moral evil. That comes as a result of our rejection of God's plan for creation. Remember, in the beginning, we were in original holiness, which meant we lived and shared in God's divine life. In other words, we didn't die, and original justice. That meant we lived in harmony with one another and creation. We fell out of that harmony when Adam and Eve rejected God's love, and that's the fall, and as a consequence of that is original sin. Original sin, remember, is that condition that we inherit that makes it difficult for us to live in harmony with God, because again, we're no longer in original holiness or original justice. So remember, original sin is more than just the first sin, and it's not that you're born sinful. It's a condition that has affected humanity and caused the suffering in the world today. But as Christians, when we look at suffering, we don't just look at it from the standpoint of what we can see and understand just with our logical mind, because ultimately suffering is a mystery. A mystery is something you can't understand using logic and reason alone. A mystery is something that calls us to understand it with faith. That's why suffering drives so many people crazy, because they can't understand why, if the world is supposed to be good, if God is supposed to be good, logically they can't understand why there's suffering in the world. It's because you're only looking at it with logic. You've got to look at it with faith. And that's where Jesus comes in. Jesus promises us that we will not be left alone to suffer in this. In fact, in the very beginning of the story, in Genesis 3, 15, that was the proto-evangelium, remember? That happens right at the time of the fall. God promises he'll crush the head of the serpent in Genesis 3:15. That was his first promise that he was going to correct the problem that had been made by humanity. And he's going to do this through suffering, through the suffering of his son, Jesus Christ. So we have the idea here that suffering is not caused by God, and although God didn't cause it, he's going to be the one who's going to help us get through our suffering. He's going to send us his son. Although Jesus will suffer for us, it doesn't mean that because Jesus suffers, none of us will suffer. Most of you can probably think of plenty of times when you suffered, but the greatest consequence of this suffering is death, and Jesus is going to save us from that. Even though our bodies will die, our souls won't die. And he's going to give us the sort of cure for all this suffering. Suffering is caused by original sin, and through his death on the cross, Jesus is going to give us the grace we need to overcome that. So, thinking about this, although we struggle with the mystery of suffering, Jesus is going to embrace it, actually. Jesus' faithfulness to his Father's mission leads him to his own crucifixion. And so we see Jesus modeling what it means to be faithful to God's plan. He is faithful to God's plan. He's faithful to God's mission. And in order for God to accomplish his mission, Jesus has to die. And that caused him great fear and anxiety. We're going to look at the agony in the garden in Matthew 26 a little more closely in the next lesson. But in the agony, we see Jesus really facing the reality of his suffering. He's scared. He says, "Might this cup pass from me?" But immediately after, he says, no, not my will, but your will be done, Lord, because he knows he's on a mission from God. And Jesus isn't accepting suffering because he's morbid or masochistic. Jesus is accepting suffering because he knows his death is going to bring about the greater good. His will is aligned with God's will and God's plan, and he accepts this suffering on our behalf. We're going to talk again about that idea of kenosis again and self-emptying. When we talked about Hesed, this goes even beyond Hesed. This isn't just a committed love. This is the love of self-sacrifice we call agape. Agape is used in particular by Jesus in the New Testament. And agape is a little bit different from Hesed because Hesed is unconditional love that God has for us. Agape is the love of sacrifice. This is the love of someone willing to die for their friends. So we're seeing that, Jesus' love for us goes to the point that he's willing to accept this sacrifice and crucifixion for us. And he does this to bring about the atonement for our sins. So let's just review that just really quick. When Jesus dies on the cross, and it says he has to do this to bring about faithfulness to the mission of God, and I talked about that promise in Genesis, God promised to correct the mistakes of the fall. Well, let's review. Why does this have to happen this way? Jesus dies on the cross because he has to repay the debt caused by our sin. Now, you might be saying, what sin? I wasn't born yet. Jesus died 2,000 years ago. He does die to correct the mistakes of all personal sin, but mainly, remember, he's dying to make up for original sin. Remember, original sin is that condition that causes us to fall out of God's union with God, and that leads us to commit more personal and social sins. So, Jesus dies on the cross to pay the price for this debt that original sin caused. So, when we're talking about Jesus' act of redemption, remember, what is redemption? R-E-D-E-M-P, redemption. When we talk about redemption, when Jesus is redeeming, what is he redeeming us from? He's redeeming us from original sin. So he's paying the price for original sin on our behalf. So he's acting on our behalf. He dies, he sacrifices, so we don't have to. Now, in some of your papers, I just want to review this with you. In some of your paragraphs, you guys wrote things like, I can be redeemed by doing acts of goodness, or, we can show people grace. When we use these terms in religious studies, redemption you can use in a general sense. For example, you probably saw this movie, The Shawshank Redemption. That was following the stories of these criminals who, despite their crimes, were doing acts of goodness in a prison, and they were redeemed by their acts of goodness. The main character in the story got redemption in the end because he got out of prison, even though he was in there unjustly. He didn't commit a crime, so it showed about his redemption from the prison. But that's using it as sort of an adjective. When we're using it in religion class, redemption within capital R, we're talking specifically about Jesus' act on the cross. We could not be redeemed from original sin had it not been for Jesus. Remember what St. Anselm said. The debt was to God, so a divine person had to be able to pay it. We can't pay this debt. But it was our debt, so a human person had to be able to pay it as well because it was caused by humanity. So Jesus, in his perfection, is both human and divine, and because he represents both sides of this covenant, he is able to pay our debt on the cross. So through his death on the cross, he pays our debt so that we can overcome original sin. But how do we do this? How do we overcome original sin by his death on the cross? Well, what happens is, through his redemptive act, what we receive is grace. So the outpouring, Paul talks about kenosis, the pouring out of his blood. What comes out as a consequence is grace. And grace is this free gift that he gives us that overcomes original sin. The only way we can get grace, though, is because of Jesus' death on the cross. You really need to connect grace with the redemptive act, because in a lot of your paragraphs you didn't do that, but grace is what we receive as a result of Jesus' redemptive act on the cross to pay for original sin. See, there's a logical progression of these ideas. And how do we receive grace? Most of you got this at baptism. Again, because it's a free gift, all you have to do is accept it, and that's what we do at baptism. As Catholics, we baptize infants, so our parents and godparents accept it on our behalf until we're confirmed in God's grace at our confirmation. Most Protestants will baptize at the age of reason, so you can accept God's grace of your own volition. So that's just to review some of these ideas, because there was, for the most part, you did pretty good on your last test, but I just wanted to review that with you a little bit to make sure you had it. So what we're going to do now is, for homework, I need you guys to get a newspaper or a news magazine. So a newspaper or a news magazine like Time or Newsweek, or U.S. and World Report, something like that. But you need to stop at the grocery store on the way home and get one of these if you don't take the paper or take a news magazine. Because next class, you need to come to class with some clippings of examples of suffering in our world. We're going to be creating posters and discussing the idea of suffering before we look specifically at the suffering of Jesus on the cross. So we're going to be making a collage. So please don't just print them off the internet. I want you to actually get a newspaper, cut out some clippings. It could be any type of suffering. It could be suffering caused by human beings, such as examples of like murder or war, or it could be natural disasters, because as you guys remember from our Father Barron lecture, even those were caused by creation falling out of alignment with God after the fall. So please bring in clippings, pictures, headlines, if there's short articles that show suffering in our world, and we're going to be working with those clippings to do an activity to reinforce this lecture. Thank you.